In-depth journalism in the Memphis community, the Daily Memphian is of Memphis, not just in Memphis, and seeks to tell the stories of this city. TheDailyMemphian.com. Truth in place.
Good morning, Grizzlies fans. Welcome back to another edition of the Daily Memphian's Memphis Grizzlies podcast. I say good morning because it is 7:37 a.m. on the dot on Sunday morning for an unexpected, I guess, Grizzlies pod. We usually don't record on the weekends, but we have a lot to get to, so that's to say the least.
In the business, they call these emergency pods. Of course, this is a little bit of a delayed emergency pod. Just like Thomas Asalo, it was a quick turnaround, and the time was a constraint. And so we thought about recording this yesterday, but then there was going to be a game. There was a game already in front of us. So let's get the game in and include that into the mix. And so here we are.
Yeah, the Grizzlies weren't the only ones that had a lot to accomplish in a small window,
Right.
So, yeah, but it's early, and we were up late at the game last night, so it'll be very interesting to see if our brains are working. The first thing my wife said to me this morning was, "The heck are you doing awake? 7 a.m. Y'all were out at the game until 1 a.m." Yep. Well, when the pod calls, the pod calls, and that
Right.
is certainly what happened today. The Grizzlies fired Taylor Jenkins. I don't know if you knew about that, Chris, but he's not the coach of the Grizzlies anymore. The guy you watch coach is Thomas Asalo, not Taylor Jenkins. It was a move that I think those that were paying attention locally, they felt like was likely to happen. I don't think anybody thought it was going to happen at the time that it did, with 9 games remaining in the regular season. It's just
I'm going to give a little peek behind the curtain here, because maybe one person thought maybe it was going to happen, and maybe that was you, because you called me about a week ago.
Yep.
And you said, "Are they going to fire Jenkins?" And I said, "Do you mean now?" And you said, "Yeah." And I said, "No, because that's never happened before. It's March 20, whatever day it was. It's March 20 something. Like this was in the last week or so." I said, "That's never happened before. It's too late." They're going to wait until after the playoffs and make their decision. And it had gotten to the point where I think a lot of people were expecting the decision to be a coaching change. I think we both were. But I didn't. I just thought it was too late. I thought, at this point, you don't do it this late in the season. But they did. They did it this late in the season. And that was the disconnect between the outside reaction and the inside reaction, is that a lot of people who follow the NBA nationally or broadly were like, "Wait a minute, why did that dude get fired?" Whereas here, I think a lot of people locally were following it, were sort of wondering about it, because it had been a conversation like around the team among media people and others, and for like the last month, wondering if this would happen.
Yeah, no, and I think what made me I'm trying to figure out the best way to say this. I think that we did think that a coaching change was going to happen, as you noted, but to me, it was the last road trip.
Right.
I sort of thought like, okay, probably not going to happen on the road, but when they come home, it was clear the message was not getting to the players, whatever Taylor Jenkins was.
No, that was exactly your hunch, and your hunch was 100% correct. And I do think it happened over the course. I know it happened the day after that OKC game. I don't think it was because of the OKC game.
No.
I suspect that a decision was made at some point over the course of the road trip. A 5-game road trip, they go 1-4. And I think at some point earlier in the season, I'm guessing the attitude was going to be, we're playing out the season, we're going through the playoffs, we'll take a look at it, we'll evaluate it then. And I think they reached a point, and I think over the road trip, they reached a point, maybe it's just that climate. I say they organizationally. But they reached a point where they decided, you know what, the playoffs won't matter to the decision. we are making a coaching change. It's not going to be, the decision is not going to change based upon what happens this spring. The decision has been made. And fairly, once that decision has been made, it's probably best to go ahead and do it. If you have decided you're firing a coach, why not? You should probably go ahead and do it. And I think that's sort of what happened. Timing is not great on it, though.
No, timing was not great. Yeah, there's a lot to get to, and I did take questions, so we may end up having, if we don't answer your question later, it's because we hope we've already answered it as we sort of just talk this out this morning.
Yeah,
But on the timing, I think maybe I'm trying to connect dots that shouldn't be connected here, but I'm curious what you think. It's like I think maybe the peek behind the curtain in terms of why they did it with 9 games left in the remainder of the season was kind of what Zach Kleiman said on Saturday morning, which was brief. It was 2 minutes and 40 seconds, and he didn't say much of anything.
right.
That I assume that was supposed to be a pointed message there, sort of the way that press conference unfolded. But Zach said, "We're going to keep expectations realistic," when he was talking about Isalo, and I think that goes sort of two ways. He's suggesting, we're not gonna say that we're not gonna expect him to come in and flip the whole thing. But I also think maybe he's saying we're not expecting this to go extremely well in the playoffs based on the way that things have gone now during the regular season. I don't know. I think we have to sort of pick that apart and decide what he meant by that. But realistic expectations can mean a lot of different things. And if you don't feel like you have a team that's capable of competing during the postseason, the Grizzlies have lost 10 straight games to teams with a winning record, then I think you have to be a little bit more comfortable in making a move like that this late in the season. And I think there's a bunch of different factors to this. Like the team defense was on the decline for a while. That had been trending for months. They couldn't beat anybody with a pulse for like 3 months. They still haven't. They've lost again 10 straight games to teams with a winning record. And then uh, you just look at the way that the team was sort of responding to Jenkins, and it just didn't seem like the locker room was in a good place, at least from looking on the outside, because you had the Bane and Santi fight, which might have been a good thing still, I think, but you had that, and
Right.
you didn't have players as quick to jump to Jenkins like defense all season the way that they might have 2 or 3 years ago. The energy was just different. Ja has seemed frankly unhappy during points of the season. Um, and like and as he said before the season, happy Ja is a scary Ja. Like you can't you I don't think that it's a very positive thing for the Grizzlies if the locker room isn't in good shape where everybody's sort of happy with each other and ready to move forward. And it just never felt like that was the case in the second half of the season. It just felt uncomfortable. I don't know why. It felt uncomfortable.
I buy, this is sort of what I wrote on my phone in a car going through Iowa. Um, I I sort of buy the notion of the team just needed a different voice because that happens in basketball. In 6 years, Taylor Jenkins has coached for almost 6 years. 6 years is a long run for an NBA head coach. He was the fifth longest tenured coach in the league. 6 years is a long time. And he has such a distinctive style of communicating. And I can see how when you're in year 5 in Desmond Bane's case, year 6, and Desmond Bane, I think, has a super close relationship with Taylor Jenkins. I'm just, and he made that clear after the game. So I'm not trying to imply anything specific with players and coaches. I'm just saying if you've been with a coach a long time, and a coach particularly who sort of communicates like Taylor Jenkins does, who tries to motivate like Taylor Jenkins does, when it's 5 years with that coach, 6 years with that coach, 4 years with that coach, depending on the players, I can see how at some point, like the effect of the voice starts to wear off, and a different approach might be needed to sort of re-energize a team. I don't know whether Thomas Asalo is the different approach that is needed. I also don't know whether anyone was going to turn it on a dime, immediately.
No, yeah.
And so the idea that a different voice in the locker room going into next season with hopefully not the same roster, but probably much the same roster, the same top three players. I'm nearly certain the top three players in the Grizzlies next season will be the top three players in the Grizzlies this season, right? And that's what matters most. The idea that you sort of you got to sort of change the temperature with a different voice. I buy that as sort of a reality. That doesn't mean they'll choose the right voice, and so that remains to be seen.
Yeah. Desmond Bain made it clear he's got a really close relationship with Jenkins. Ja made it very clear that he has a really close relationship with Jenkins. So again, I didn't want on what I said earlier. I'm not implying anybody had anything to do with this. And Zach Kleiman repeated it over and over again. He was the only one that made the decision. I'm just speaking generally for the fact that the locker room was more uncomfortable. It just was.
Well, and you wonder if not only is it year 6, with Jenkins, but I mean the players all know that the management basically made him change his coaching staff. And then the coaching staff has changed in a way that he is, trying to implement ideas. He's trying to synthesize. We can get into this. He was trying to synthesize. I can't speak this morning. My brain is working, but my mouth is not. He tried to bring together, and implement, some ideas from other places, which is not that unusual. Like assistant coaches bring stuff to the table. But this was more that than is typical in the NBA, where, you wonder if he was undercut a little bit from the jump in that regard, right? In terms of his control, his authority, the sense that this guy, if we knew Jenkins was on a little bit, if we knew Jenkins was under the spotlight going into the season and was maybe on some shaky ground, I mean, the players knew that too.
Yeah, it's what's interesting is, as you mentioned, what we can get into this is the schemes that the team ended up using. I think there's some confusion here, especially with
there's a lot of confusion. It's also probably been a little bit it's overemphasized as the issue, as an issue.
Potentially.
I mean, the defense is what's been the problem the last month, more so than the offense.
No, yeah, but it's I watched the ESPN clip last night when I got home because I know you had mentioned it. And this is why I'm really glad I wrote about this stuff. So feel like I have a pretty good grasp of it, but it was not. It is not Asalo's new offense that they installed, and then they went ahead and moved forward with it and sort of said, no, this is what we're going to play, whether you like it or not, Taylor Jenkins. That's not what happened here.
No.
In fact, it was, a lot of the stuff the Grizzlies were doing actually comes from St. Joseph's of Maine, Division III school, where Noah LaRoche sort of helped install that offense. The Grizzlies also hired 2 hustle staffers from that school.
Yeah, I want to make it. Everything you're saying is accurate, of course. I want to make even a finer distinction on it. The offense has evolved over the course of the season. And the defense has been the problem with the last month. It's where their emphasis was in training camp. They had these different philosophies or different approaches they were trying to integrate and put pieces together into a new whole. And some of that was this Noah LaRoche philosophy, and some of it was this Thomas Asalo philosophy, and maybe some of it was stuff they were already doing. But they chose from the jump to lean hard into not the Thomas Asalo philosophy in terms of scheme. There's some other things that they've done, which we talk about. But they leaned more into the Noah LaRoche stuff. And then that they were starting to integrate other stuff over time. And they were integrating. They had as Thomas Hassan was sort of intimated before the game. They had started to add more pick and rolls over the last month, which was something that he associated with himself. But their focus at training camp was heavily on the quote unquote space and principles that was more associated with LaRoche. And I think people around the country haven't people around the country who are looking at the Grizzlies and saying, "Oh, they stopped running pick and roll and they hired this new coach," have made these associations without not themselves being able to sort through the different pieces.
Yeah, we should mention LaRoche was also fired along with Taylor Jenkins and Patrick St. Andrews. So it's a new direction. It's a new direction. But as Isalo said, not a lot of time. There's no time for a massive offensive overhaul, nor is it needed, I think is exactly the way he put it. And he's probably right. I mean, the Grizzlies have not had a bad offense this season. They play with an intense pace, and I think that's some of the thinking of Asalo. Really, the pace at which the Grizzlies play is sort of something that he's been in control of this season. Um, but yeah, there's been some confusion there. Has there been anything else you think we should clarify, Chris, in terms of the situation?
Well, I think maybe my attempt at clarification got it off track a little bit, but what you were saying about some of the national response was the idea that by the idea that elevate that the Grizzlies going away from more screen and pick and roll stuff was going away from John Morant, and that by elevating Asalo, they were doubling down on that, and that is it's really the opposite. They are, and we'll see if Asalo keeps the job. But Asalo is not a signal of trending more in an offense that doesn't feature John Morant. It's really trending back the other way, and that's what I think is misunderstood.
Yeah. No, I 100% think that's accurate. So the Grizzlies end up actually let's before we move on to that. How do you think Taylor Jenkins, excuse me, will be remembered as a Grizzlies coach?
Well, I mean, he's the winningest coach in franchise history in the regular season. I think, but the playoff struggles. I mean, he lost three consecutive game ones on the home full court as the higher seed, right? And so I think he'll be remembered as fairly or not as a developmental coach who took a young team and took them to a certain spot, and then we'll see after that. I don't know. I don't have a good answer for that. I guess I don't think Jenkins. I think Jenkins was well liked and well respected, but I don't think he was like a beloved character in the way that, say, Hubie Brown was. And so he's the winningest coach in franchise history record wise. I don't think people would call him like, if you're making your all time Grizzlies team, I don't think he's the coach of that team.
Yeah. Um, in the column I wrote on Friday when he was fired, um, I kind of went through the different stops on his career, and obviously, right from the jump to get the team to the bubble and like have them be part of the, you know, sort of the postseason race, to have the play-in appearances, to get into the postseason against Utah, then to, win a playoff series and against Minnesota, and then the next year, obviously, the way that it happened with the Lakers, it all sort of turned um, after they lost that series to Golden State, and it felt like they were just trying to recapture from there. And they made the playoffs. They played against the Lakers in the first round, and Game 6 ended with a 40-point blowout. You come back the next year, there's the Ja suspension. There's uh, or sorry, that the Ja suspension started the year that they lost to the Lakers, but you had the 25 game Ja suspension, all the injuries, that crumbles. Then this year it looks like they might be getting it back on track, and then that sort of comes undone. So it was like this slow build. It felt like up to that season that Ja was like getting MVP votes and they beat the Timberwolves, and then maybe a little bit of a slower descent after that. Um, but I do think, again, you're right. I don't know if he's going to be the most popular coach. I think that he was most popular, as I said this to you last night. I think he was at his most popular point when he took the fine against the Timberwolves after that loss in game 4, and he just absolutely blasted the officials. There's a lot of people standing up saying, "That's my coach." And then ever since then, it felt like, the support just sort of was slowly fading out. Um, yeah, we will. We'll have more time to digest this and like talk about what Taylor Jenkins means to the big picture later. But the team's moved on, and we got to move on. Um, Asalo. So he's named the interim head coach later that day. It was interesting last night because he does have a totally different voice than Taylor Jenkins. You wrote it in your column that I read this morning. It's just it's like bizarre that hearing a different voice almost because it's been so long. And like I haven't covered another coach for this team. Like,
Well, and John Morant and Desmond Bane hadn't played for another coach.
yeah.
And so that's partly why I wonder about the different voice of the players, because it's even for people who just like talk to them before and after games, it's so different. Now, different doesn't necessarily mean more effective. I don't know whether Asalo's quote unquote voice as a coach is what the Grizzlies need. I don't really know either way on that. And I don't know if we're going to find out in 8 games and the Grizzlies have to make a decision, based on the sample. But it is very different. Like I sort of semi joked in the column that like Taylor Jenkins practiced what he preached in terms of pace. Like, like he wanted to play fast, he wanted to talk fast, and like it seemed like in some ways it seemed like Jenkins was always sort of like making a case for himself a little bit or making a case for what he was doing. Asalo seems very comfortable in his skin. And all of his responses seem to like he seemed to really stop and like think about what the question was and think about what his answer was. And it seems like it came across as stuff he's really thought a lot about. He seems comfortable with what he thinks about things, but also flexible about it. I asked him last night about the minutes distribution. This was another game, by the way, when this has been the case all season, and this is something that ties back to Asalo. Yeah, the sort of no pick and roll schemes that they began the season with did not come from him, but leaning more into playing a deep rotation with low minutes at the top for your top players, with quick substitution patterns, and having all of that stuff be related to trying to play at a fast pace and thinking that will make your fast pace more effective. That's stuff we've been talking about all season, and that is Asalo. And I asked him about that last night because this was a game they lost by 7 points. It's in the heat of a playoff race. It's the most important game of the season. You lose by 7. Your starters are playing well. It was your bench that was the problem. You won the minutes essentially when your starters were out there, and Desmond Bane led the Grizzlies with under 33 minutes, and the top 3 Lakers all played more than 37. Like there have been box scores like this all season. I look at it and I say, well, wait a minute. If your guys play 36, 37 minutes, you might win this game. And I asked him about that last night, and I thought his response was he sort of defended the idea, but he had what I think was the best art. And I've asked this question of Taylor Jenkins all year, right? Multiple times probably. But Asalo had, I think, the clearest and best articulation of why it may not work, even though he is doing it. And he basically said, he basically stated the idea of if you play these deeper rotations, slower minutes, et cetera, can you play with more pace and more intensity than the other team? And can you make that pace and intensity a competitive advantage? And then he said this. He said, but I do know if you play your stars less minutes and you play with the same intensity as the other team, it won't work. And if you can't play with the more intensity, maybe you need to go play the starters more. And that's been the story a lot of this season. They haven't, especially lately, early on, like they would run off on bad teams, but against the good teams, they don't play with their intensity is not overwhelming the good teams. Instead, it's either the same or worse, and then their stars are playing less, and that's what the outcomes have been. And so I still look at that same game and I think about playoff basketball, and I ask the question I've been asking all season. Yeah, okay, so they lost that game, but like if you replay that game again and John Morant plays 37 minutes and Bane plays 37 and like Jaren, I know Jaren had the fouls, but guess what? He finished with 4. If you ignore the foul stuff and Jaren plays 37 minutes, they might win that game. And the mood's totally different. And so that's why I'm still not giving up on the idea of Grizzlies as competitive in playoff basketball, because they still haven't played playoff basketball. And I'm interested to see if Asalo, who is sort of dedicated is not the right word. He believes in the concept, but if he sees the concept not working, he might change it.
Yeah, he didn't sound wedded to the idea,
Right.
He because he presented the argument on either side, and it was just a different answer than what we would have gotten from Jenkins,
Well,
which would have been
on so many questions, it almost came across as a little bit of like a sort of like a plain spoken basketball philosopher. Like, I think I thought a lot about a lot of this stuff, and like, and I don't know, it was just a different kind of thing. And I liked it personally in terms of what I sort of enjoy, like, and conversationally. But what I enjoy has nothing to do with like what's effective as a basketball coach, and that's what remains to be seen.
yeah. No, that's right. That's exactly right. He also had an answer that I found somewhat refreshing about the defense. Immediately after that, he gets asked about the 3-point defense. And, he said essentially that the Grizzlies are doing the simple things wrong too often. And that was clearly, by the way, doing the simple things right. The quote, doing the simple things right was clearly the message to the team because
Right.
it was what was repeated by multiple players in the locker room after Asalo had already said it at the podium. So I think we know what he told the team. But he said, it starts with doing the simple things right, and that their shifts on defense are just, they're not executing them the way that they should. And he went on to say, like, this isn't a matter of us over helping. Sometimes it's a matter of us under helping. And
Right.
what fans think that isn't necessarily true. Is that the guys are giving up. But the truth is that's not it at all. It's everybody's overcompensating because they don't trust that the other person's going to be able to do their job. They're not, it's
Right.
not, it's not that. And he said, so for us, it starts with getting the simple things right so that we can build that trust so that we can play better defense.
No,
And
no, no, no. I agree. That he seems to see things very clearly. He seems to see things well and articulate them clearly, right? And so and it's easy to see. Like, this is not someone. This is not some, like, hotshot new assistant or whatever who's never been a head coach, as you've written about earlier. Like, he was an extremely successful head coach in Europe. There is a pattern in the NBA in the past of head coaching success at other levels translating to NBA. That used to be like the CBA a lot, with the precursor to the G League. There was all kinds of head coaches who like won titles at the CBA and then became great NBA head coaches or good NBA head coaches. George Karl was one of those. There are others I can't remember. Dave Yeager was a big time head coach in the G League and then became a good head coach in the NBA. Mike D'Antoni was a good head coach overseas and came back to the NBA and was a good head coach. The fact that he has successful head coaching experience, even though it's outside the NBA, and B, he is a former player. Like, he didn't play in the NBA, but he was a player and is able to sort of see things that well and articulate them that clearly. I think there's lots of great qualities. He's a really interesting, like, coaching prospect is, I guess, the right word for right now. But again, like, does that cool demeanor, is that sort of what the Grizzlies need in this moment, like in the locker room and the huddles on the sideline kind of thing? Or is this demeanor not that cool? Is it different in those settings that we don't see or whatever? To me, there's a lot of questions about that in terms of, like, is this the guy who's going to motivate the team?
yeah,
And
well, I'll say this though. I think that there's the potential that answer is yes, given what we saw over the last couple months and just how sort of high strung everything seemed to be.
right.
And like,
Now that
again, back to the Santi and Bain thing, like that, like They may need the cooler heads to prevail. They
Yeah,
might. That might
yeah.
be the formula. We don't know. It's up for the Grizzlies to. The Grizzlies are going to have to decide that. But
No, no,
it's
that's a
an
good.
option.
No, you found a really good description for it in terms of like Jenkins was a little high strung, and Asylum comes along across this little cooler. And typically, when you make a coaching change, you look for something different. The question is, what kind of different are you looking for, right? Like, what is different from Taylor Jenkins? You can go back to like Tiger basketball over the years, like when Josh Pastner's run was done, you go to Tubby Smith, like the exact opposite, right? There, Tubby Smith was pretty dull. Now Penny's more exciting or whatever. It tend oftentimes when you're changing when you're getting rid of a coach, it's because you want something different. So what's the something different? Well, Jenkins, it could be any number of things, right? It could be, do you want more? Was he too accommodating to players? You want more of a tough guy disciplinarian? What do you want someone who comes into it with head coaching experience that he didn't have? Do you want someone who like players can relate to as a former player? That would be a different thing. But maybe part of the different is just sort of is what you just said in terms of the intensity of his personality versus a little bit of cooler personality. Maybe that's the difference.
Yeah, we'll see. We have a lot of other questions to answer from listeners online. We'll get to that in just a second. But first, let's take a break for a message from our sponsor.
Want to make a big impact without getting lost in a big system? Join Youth Villages to be a force for families while becoming part of one. Help make positive changes on a national scale, one community at a time. It takes a family to transform lives. Start with yours. Apply now at youthvillages.org/careers.
All right, let's answer some of these because I think it'll help us touch on a few things we haven't been able to get to yet. Starting with here, what do you feel like the team's ceiling is now that BC is hurt? I mean, it's not like I don't know how much it changes the team ceiling based on the way that they were playing, but obviously it's a big blow, you know?
Um, I still think this team can win a playoff series. I do. I'm not predicting they will. I'm not saying that's likely. But I go back to what I was saying a few minutes ago. Like, what does it look like if they actually do play playoff basketball rotations, which they don't do? If they do that, if it's a 9-man rotation and your stars are playing 37 minutes instead of an 11-man rotation and your stars are playing 32, I think that matters when you're talking about games that are decided by like 7, 8, 9 points, And so I think this team. John Morant said something interesting last night, which was he was asked, like, so what can this team accomplish at this point? So the implication that this is all falling apart, which everyone sort of feels. And he just sort of shrugged at it and was like, we're not eliminated from the playoffs. We can accomplish whatever we want. And they're going to be in postseason basketball. That might be us the 5. That might be us the 6. That might be us the 4. It might be us the 7 or 8. And you got to play through a play in, right? They're not going to, when game 82 ends, they will not be done playing. They will still get to play again. And if they're healthy, they're going to have John Morant, Desmond Bane, and Jared Jackson. And I think that team is capable of winning the playoff series. Now, given the loss of Brandon Clark and given the stuff around it, I wouldn't put the ceiling higher than that. But if we're talking about a ceiling, this team should not give up on the idea of advancing to the playoffs.
I agree. And it was interesting because I was in the middle of writing a newsletter on Friday that got axed, obviously, because of the Jenkins news. But as I was writing it, that news broke. And the topic of the newsletter was I'm going to be really interested to watch these last 2 weeks because these teams are in such a tight jumble in the standings that there could be maneuvering in order to get certain playoff matchups. And I was openly wondering if the Lakers or the Nuggets would be trying to set up a series with the Grizzlies if they could do it.
Oh,
Because they still at that point had games against them set up.
Oh, the Grizzlies certainly look like a team you would try to target right now. I mean, that's true. But, it could be a be careful what you wish for situation,
I think especially with LA and like I know that the Grizzlies lost last night, but I I think the Lakers have such high end talent that if they got matched up with the Grizzlies, I don't know how you couldn't feel better about where the Lakers stand right now, especially given what we just watched last night. But the Lakers have glaring weaknesses, and the Grizzlies have weaknesses. And I don't necessarily think that the Lakers are the best team to take advantage of the Grizzlies' weaknesses. Does that make sense?
Ja was a mess in the first half of that game, his first game back from the injury. He was just a mess in the first half. And Jaron, like, got one thing Asalo did do differently is that he put, and I guess you could say it came back to bite him. Hopefully he's the kind of guy who won't like see this and like just never do it again. But Jared got the 2 fouls in the first quarter, and then he brought him back to start the second quarter. Taylor Jenkins would not have brought Jared back in to start the second quarter with the 2 fouls. Asalo did, and Jared immediately got a third foul, and then he had him out for the rest of the game. But I like that he brought him back with the 2 fouls, which Jenkins would not have done at that moment. He should have let him keep playing. So what happens in that game if like John Morant is in more of a rhythm in the first half and it's not his first half back from injury, and they ignore the fouls and Jaren Jackson play 16 minutes in the first half instead of 8? They may have won that game last night.
Yeah, they might have. So and like the Lakers, they don't have. They're so thin in the front court. Like they went to Asante at the 5. The Grizzlies went to Asante at the 5 lineup for a couple minutes. It almost felt like it was just because the Lakers had too many guards out there, and they just were like, "All right, well, screw it. Then we're not playing with the center."
Neither it's essentially a matchup because neither team has good defensive answers for the other team's best players. The Lakers don't have a great defensive matchup for John Morant, and they sure don't have a great defensive matchup for Jaren Jackson Jr. At the same time, the Grizzlies are small on the wing, small and young, and like they don't have good matchups for LeBron James and Luka Doncic. You know,
Yeah. So that would be an interesting series. Okay. I'm gonna keep moving here. Somebody said based on the article, it sounded like Ja learned the news from the media and friends, while Jared and Bain heard from the organization directly. Seems awfully meaningful to me, but thoughts from you and Chris. I don't make much of that. I have no doubts that the Grizzlies probably told Ja as well. Ja said he was in bed, right? So
right?
I would assume he was sleeping and saw it all at once. So I would not read too much into that. I don't know. That's my thoughts.
No, to me, I don't read much into it either, and I think it's a little unclear. You know, I asked Zach Kleiman that morning, yesterday morning, was it yesterday? Yes, whether it was funny, like the lawyer instinct sort of pops in, right? Even when I don't know if it was necessary. I asked him if any of the players were alerted. Alerted was the word I used. Alerted to the change. And his response was none of the players were consulted on the change. Which I think he was clear to say that because he doesn't want to give the implication that the players had anything to do with the dismissal. But I was really asking, like, did you let them know before you did it? Not did you consult them on the decision, but after you had made the decision, did you call them up and say, "Hey, I'm about to do this"? And apparently, he suggested he didn't. But I don't think any of that stuff is particularly telling or matters much either way.
There's a few questions about whether Asala is going to have a chance to be the next head coach. Um, I have some thoughts on this, but I'll let you go first if you do.
Um, I, I think you probably have a better read on this than I do. To me, I have a hard time getting a read on it. The question would be whether that has already been decided or not, right? Was he brought in with the idea that he's the head coach in waiting and they want him to be the head coach and he's going to be the head coach? Or, barring this quote unquote audition going very poorly? Or is it truly a case of like, they don't know? We've been down this road before where like, Dave Yeager, when they let go of Lionel Hollins, Dave Yeager was going to be a quote unquote candidate. They interviewed other people, though they were always just going to give it to Dave Yeager, and they knew that. So I honestly don't have a good read of where it is with Asala. What's your read?
If the parameters of the question are, does he have a chance?
Well, the answer is yes to
Chance.
that.
The answer is absolutely yes to that. A good chance. I mean, I would probably say yes. But I don't think that this is anything surefire. Like I wouldn't. I think the Grizzlies are gonna. The Grizzlies would not be smart organization to not conduct a full search and figure out who the best person for the team is going to be. Like that's what they have to do. I do know that they really liked Asalo when they brought him in from Europe, and like they went to pretty strong lengths in order to bring him to the Grizzlies. And to me, that suggested that they really wanted him to be a coach. Um, and so, I think if you go back, if you rewind, like Asala was not just getting interest from the Grizzlies. He was
Right.
getting interest from multiple NBA teams. He wasn't just getting interest as an assistant coach. He was getting interest for head coaching positions. So, um, he was already considered a coach, the caliber of coach that could get an NBA head coaching job. So I think he absolutely should be considered to be the head coach. I think but now you've had a season to see it. We haven't seen it the way that some of the Grizzlies have seen it. We don't know what the relationship is like between Asalo and the Stars the same way the Grizzlies front office would know.
Right.
So it's hard to say like whether or not like he's the front runner for something like this. But I can tell you, based on everything that the way that the Grizzlies have acted, the way that the Grizzlies went and got him, like that to me suggests that the Grizzlies really believe in the guy. And so I would be shocked if he didn't get an opportunity or a real look at this thing, you know?
The one thing I'll say is that, and I don't mean this to imply any decision they should make, but I think it's imperative for the Grizzlies to, and I think they do recognize this, but I'm just going to say it's imperative for them to recognize this is not an expansion team. This is not a rebuilding situation. This is not a who is our ideal coach in an ideal situation. They have to think about it can't just be we like this guy's philosophy and approach. It has to be, do we think this coach is the right guy for this team at this time to motivate these players? And that's got to be paramount in the way they approach this.
Yep.
Because it is go time.
Yeah. No. The windows open and close quickly in the NBA, and you never know when it's going to be over. And right now, you've got three very talented young players under contract, and it's time to win. Um, that sort of leads into the next question. Like, so a few people asked, what kind of coach should the Grizzlies look for, in your opinion? Is there any other name that comes to mind? Like, there's going to be popular names out there, but I don't think we're in a place at all yet to like speculate who the Grizzlies may end up having interest in. I'm just curious in terms of personality. Is there anything you think might be a fit?
I don't know. I'm reluctant to say like it has to be one kind of thing. I do I do I do wonder if Jenkins was a little bit too much of a quote unquote players coach and maybe a little bit more discipline, a little bit more challenge towards the players might be necessary. Um, the team will have a better read on whether they think or should have a better read on whether they think like that approach would be better for this group of players or not. But I wonder about that.
Yeah.
There was a thing that I'd been noticing all season that had sort of bothered me, and I just left it alone because it seemed like sort of a churlish thing to point out. But in the last week, I saw fans on social media pointed out, which is the thing where like part of the pregame routine would be at the very end, right before they take the court, like Taylor Jenkins and John Morant would do a little dance together.
Mhm.
And I just remember looking at that and saying, like, I don't know if I want my head coach doing that, like Lionel Hollins. When I interviewed Lionel Hollins for the Tony Allen story, he had a funny thing which I left out because of the tangent. He was talking about when he was an assistant for the Lakers a couple years ago. His last stop was the LeBron James Lakers. Lionel Hollins was an assistant. He was telling me that LeBron had a different handshake for every person on the team and every coach, and it was a different handshake for everybody. And he was like, I could remember. I can't remember all that. I can't be bothered with that. He wouldn't even do the handshakes with LeBron, right? And sometimes I do wonder if maybe we need a little bit less of like trying to be the player's buddy. It's sort of like the parent trying to be your friend or trying to be your parent kind of thing. So I wonder, and I'm not saying Asalo couldn't be that.
Yeah.
Was not Danzo's job before the game, by the way. But I wonder if they need a little bit more more of a disciplined kind of approach.
Do you know the story behind that dance?
I don't.
So that was something that Ja used to do with Tyus Jones when Tyus Jones was here, and it
Oh,
used to be a
now I
tradition.
remember
It
that.
used to
Yeah.
be a tradition, and so he would do that with Tyus Jones before every single game. And then when Tyus was gone, Ja went to Taylor and was like, "Hey, I want to keep my tradition going," and Taylor did it.
All right.
Whatever. It's a thing of the past now, but that's where that comes from. Um, Someone asks about the roster. And says, well, I'll just read the question straight as it is. We know this roster is an issue. If you could reset it, who are the players you are definitely wanting to keep?
I mean, there may be some people out there who would want to get rid of the top three guys, but that's certainly not me. And so I mean, I'm definitely keeping those guys.
I
You know,
wonder. Okay, let's let. Can I pivot this question a little
yeah,
bit? Like
please, I welcome a pivot.
we we've spent a lot of time talking about Santi, who's going to be a restricted free agent, and talking about the Grizzlies and sort of at the deadline that they liked Santi, that the talent is there. He's still young. He still can be sort of molded, and that we thought that there was real opportunity. Santi has not had the same second half of the season. So assuming that the top three guys are the guys you're going to keep, my question is more so: is Santi the fourth? Is Santi next on the list?
I do this exercise at the end of every season where I rank the players and count them down in terms of importance to the organization going forward. And I have not thought about that exercise, so I'm sort of thinking about it right now. Santi has been the fourth best player on the team, and I think they should bring Santi back, certainly. But if my top three guys are Ja, Dez, and Jaron, what I most the number one thing I want is defensive infrastructure around those guys. And so, like, I think going forward it might be Zach Edey. I think Zach Edey's got to work, right? And that's one of the things I think Asalo embraces the idea of Edey in an up tempo system and put him back in the starting lineup last night. But I look at Edey, I look at the way Pippen's come on, I look at Jalen Wells and Vince Williams, even though Vince has been banged up. And those are sort of the kind of players I needed my rotation around John Morant, Desmond Bain, and Sharon Jackson. I, it may be that when I do that piece, my number four guy might end up being Zach Edey. Zach Edey's the guy who's going to start long term on this team.
Yeah, I'm glad you got to that because that's another one of these questions. Like people wondering Edie's usage. What does this mean for Edie now that Asala is the coach? And I think there's certainly a possibility that he's utilized in the pick and roll more than he was before. Again, though, that time is a constraint. They don't have time to overhaul everything. But I found it notable that Edie played well last night against the Lakers team that's lacking a lot of size. Like, but that can play both ways, right? There's been times where it's like, oh, we can't use Zach Edey because defensively we can't get him to a point where we can still switch on defense and get stops. But then there's also the idea that Zach Edey might grab four offensive rebounds in a span of 3 minutes and score three buckets and help you flip a game. Um, and it was good. It was a good Zach Edey performance last night. But I'll be curious to see how Asalo uses him for sure.
Well, I mean, he did just a couple notes on that game. I mean, he did go with Aldama, not Edey, down the stretch, which has been sort of common, presumably because of defensive purposes. He talked about in the pregame or the postgame about wanting to match Edey up with Jackson Hayes. So that made me wonder: is this a permanent starting lineup change or was it a matchup based change? Either way, it's notable. If it's a permanent change, it is going back to something Jenkins had gone away from. If it was just a matchup based change for one night, the idea of doing matchup based starting lineup is something that would be new, right? I mean, Jenkins has not been someone who would want to target matchups as much. So I'm interested in all that and see where it goes in the short term. But in the long term, I think the Grizzlies want and need to maximize Zach Edey, and they did not draft Zach Edey with the idea that he wouldn't fit in what they wanted to do. They drafted Zach Edey with the idea that he would exactly fit in what they wanted to do. And I think they had more of the Asalo system in mind when they drafted Edey than they did the LaRoche system. We talk about that stuff in terms of John Morant, but it's almost more of a thing with Zach Edey.
Yeah. Um, I agree, and I think that Edie is. I don't. Edie to me it might be number four as well. I think you have to really think about that if you were trying to sort of put the players in order. Although I'm surprised your guy Vince, man. I don't know where that's your guy.
Yeah, I mean the rationality has to take over at some point. He can't be fourth on the list.
Um, this is from Blue Sky. Help me make sense of the timing and letting go of Jenkins, LaRoche, and Patrick St. Andrews. Even if you're committed to move on from them, how is it not a huge risk to suddenly reshape your coaching staff to that degree so close to the playoffs? To
Well,
give
it's
the
not.
first year NBA coach 2 weeks, before the start.
It's not. I mean, it's not a risk if you believe that if you believe it's not a risk because you think it's not working out with what you have and it's not going to turn around and you think nothing is going to change the ultimate decision, right? I mean, we've been talking about this, but I mean,
Yeah,
they didn't believe it was a risk. Otherwise, they wouldn't have done it. They believed that it had passed that point.
right, right. The trajectory was undeniable, right? And it was not going inspiring any
They,
confidence going into the postseason.
well,
So,
they felt it was undeniable. I want to make a distinction between
yes,
what the Grizzlies seem to have determined, sort of like the Marcus Smart trade. What the Grizzlies had determined versus what is true. I mean, maybe those things are in line, maybe
the
they're not. I
statistics
don't
are
know.
undeniable. Statistically, it's undeniable that they were worse since the turn of the new year.
Sure.
That's the 100% true. So, right. Like if you it's not a risk if you feel like you're again if you're following realistic expectations, right? Like if this team had a small chance before the Brandon Clark injury to like make the finals, they have the same very small chance right now. And so I don't think that they necessarily felt like that was some sort of major risk. Um, a question about the perimeter defense. I think we sort of addressed that with the Salah's answer earlier. Um, there's a couple questions about whether or not if Asala was coaching the whole season, how do you feel like the team would be doing if it would be any different than Jenkins? I think that's pretty much that's impossible to answer unless you have any thoughts.
Well, it brings up the question of getting getting the intensity, getting consistent intensity, especially on the defensive end. That's the biggest thing. And there are roster issues, and changing the coach doesn't change the roster issues. It doesn't change the injury issues. And from an offensive scheme thing, I think it would have been different with Asalo. But if the offense has been good already, it's like sixth in the NBA, and it's been better in the half court. I do think the offensive issues, and I expressed this months ago. I think they were too slow to work back in some of the screen and pick and roll stuff, not because that would have made the offense better, but because that would have engaged important players more in John Morant and Zach Edey. And it's not always about, I said this on Jeff Coffey's show, it's not always about like giving the spreadsheet and what play type has the highest points per play. It's about managing your personnel. And if you're doing things in a way that where some of the personnel feels marginalized, some of the important personnel feels marginalized, maybe you want to run more of that, even if it's slightly less efficient than something else, because it helps, get guys integrated. So I think the offensive stuff would have been fine, maybe better with Asalo. But the question would he be able to get better defensive effort? And I don't know that he would. I don't know that he wouldn't. It's a complete unknown. That's the question.
Yeah, no, it's I don't think I could tell you whether or not the team would be better. Because we haven't seen enough of Salo yet, right? We haven't
Right.
seen and I don't think we're ever going to get that sample to feel like we could say one way or another. Um, there's some question on X about Zach Kleiman's job security now in this situation. Um, I I fully expect that Zach's probably going to be the one to hire the next coach, right? Barring something
Right.
unexpected. Like this is the order of operations in the NBA, right? Um, usually it's the coach that goes. And so, I think it's going to be important. that Zach gets the next head coach right, that he hires the right person, but like that's true of every GM. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, I think the first lever when things start seem to stall out a little bit with a team, the first lever is usually a coaching change. Like that's usually the first thing that happens. And then maybe that fixes that fixes everything or gets everything back on track. It did with Cleveland. That's the example I've been citing all season. Um, and if not, then other levers might get pulled, and those levers could be trading, one of your top players and shaking up your core. One of those levers could be a front office change. I I I would be very, very, very surprised if Zach Kleiman doesn't have a full summer to hire a new coach, to sign Jaron Jackson, hopefully to a new contract, to fiddle with the roster and bring and do whatever is needed this summer, whatever's going to happen this summer to bring this team into next season. I entirely expect Zach Kleiman will be the one doing that. I do
You
think it's
can't know how Robert Pera thinks
no,
about
no, no. That's why
none of us can know.
no, everything's qualified because we don't know. Taylor Jenkins' boss is Zach Kleiman. Zach Kleiman's boss is Robert Pera, and like Robert Pera hasn't shown his face in years, so who knows? But just thinking about the way things usually work, what is normal? I fully expect Zach Kleiman will lead this team through a very important summer and bring them into next season. And I think Zach Kleiman next season could be kind of like Taylor Jenkins this season, and that we knew going in there was more of a microscope on Taylor Jenkins this season than there had been before. That was known from the jump this season. We talked about it, we wrote about it, the whole shebang. I think there's probably more of a microscope on Zach Kleiman next season. And that if you look up a year from today and the team doesn't seem to have a higher competitive ceiling, then then I think that could be an issue.
I think that that's true of almost any person that's put in charge of hiring a coach in any sport, anywhere. You
Right.
know, like that's SEC athletic directors are judged based on how they hire football coaches, right? Like it's such an important part of the job. I know roster management and all that's very important too, but like hiring the right coach is such an important part of the job. And I feel like the Grizzlies did make a good hire when they hired Taylor Jenkins. Like the trajectory of the team changed. He clearly helped the Stars get there. Now it's time for a new voice, a new person, and getting this one right is going to be important. So it'll be interesting to see what happens. Just a couple more here, and then we'll check out because we've already been talking for a while. But um, uh, we've talked about this a couple of times. Ideal 8-9 man rotation for the playoffs. Like, who do we think is going to be in and who might be out if they do that?
I think right now, I think the starting five, that whether that's the starting five in the playoffs or whether you start Santi, but those five players they started last night would be among the five. I think Santi Aldama and Scottie Pippen, clearly the way Pippen's been playing, that gets you to seven. And then you're looking at Luke Kennard, who had a nothing game, had a really bad game last night, like 21 minutes of nothing. You have Vince Williams, who's been not so great, but like those are, unless I'm forgetting someone, which I might be, those are sort of the next two guys. So in terms of getting to 8 or 9, am I forgetting? Who am I forgetting? Am I forgetting someone?
Kennard, or did you say him?
Yeah, I said Kennard. I said Kennard and Vince.
Might be forget. I mean, yeah, that's
Yeah,
it, right?
yeah, because it would have
Nine.
been Brandon Clark.
Who who's gonna play? Who's gonna be the first person to come off the bench in a playoff game where we're like, oh wow, because that'll happen in one of these games. They'll get desperate. They'll try to find something. They'll. Is it
If
gonna
they
be Conchar? Or is it gonna be Huff?
if they play the Lakers, it's going to be the guy it was last night, Lamar Stevens, for the
Lamar
reason
Stevens,
because
yeah.
I said that on the radio a couple weeks ago. If they get into a series with the Lakers, like you may throw Lamar Stevens out there to try to guard LeBron and Luca just because he has the size.
Um, Someone asked a question about, were there any key roster moves in the past that in hindsight the team should have thrown more assets at to execute? I mean, we're so late in the season at this point. It's like that feels like a long time ago, the trade deadline, especially
There,
with this team.
there's no sense that they were in terms of stuff we know about. there's no sense that they were just like a little bit extra away from making like the Mikael Bridges trade happen or the OG Anunoby trade happen or any of those kind of trades. It does seem pretty clear that they could have pushed it a little bit more and made the Dorian Finney-Smith trade happen. Would that have fundamentally changed the team? At this point, especially with Clark out, I don't know. And so, in retrospect, was that worth pushing more in on that one? Maybe, maybe not. I think obviously you would like to go back and use the assets you used for Marcus Smart on something else. That would be if I had to pick, if I had to get a do over, like maybe that's the do over.
Yeah. I don't know if there's anything specific I could point out to. I mean, the Dorian Finney-Smith stuff was like, I don't know how different this team would be right now if he was on the
Right.
roster, for just being honest. So, I mean, I don't know if I have anything to add there.
It might honestly. I mean, he could be starting at the three, and then you wouldn't have Kennard, who's been sort of up and down. So maybe that. I don't think that wins you a title, but like maybe that makes you a better team in a first round playoff series.
It might. I just wasn't particularly inspired by Dorian Finney-Smith last night, I think, watching
Right.
the Lakers. Um, there's a question on Blue Sky and a question on X, both about trying to identify what was the turning point on the season in terms of the season going downhill. Um, and to me, it's kind of hard to figure out. I don't know if it's exactly one thing. I think it's been a lot of different things, but I mean, Ja's health plays a factor in this, certainly, you know, and I just think that there's been a lack of attention to detail, a lack of intensity, as Salo put it. But I don't think that there's any one singular thing as the turning point that I could pinpoint.
Well, I do think the schedule got harder, and like
Yeah.
maybe there was a little bit of a mirage aspect early in the season against a weaker schedule. I think at the margins, I know Marcus Smart didn't play a lot, and didn't play well offensively, but actually the defensive numbers were good when he played. But like the Jake LaRavia Smart out, Gigi Jackson diminished Vince Williams in, that ended up being a drag rather than a boost. And maybe at the margins, like that was part of it in terms of your defense sort
Mhm.
of slipping.
Okay. Well, that we're gonna wrap that up on the questions there. Sorry if we didn't get to yours. There was a lot. I was not expecting to get that many, considering I posted it at midnight last night. So, um, Grizzlies, last thing before we get out of here, 1.5 games up on the Clippers and the Warriors now, fifth place in the Western Conference and a full game behind the LA Lakers. Now 2.5 games behind Denver. That doesn't feel like it's gonna it feels like four might be
Well,
the
well,
the, the top
and
spot.
now they're facing a back to back against the Celtics and the Warriors, and like is Ja going to play both halves of that back to back? It feels like this is if they're going to steady themselves under Asalo and with Morant back from his hamstring strain, it feels like it may not happen for another couple games, right? You may get through these next two games and then take a breath and sort of stabilize yourself for this last five or six before you get into the postseason. And if that's going to be the case, like it may be hard to stay out of the play in.
Yeah. No, I'm a lot less confident than I was last week. I feel like I've been going through these waves. Like you're like, all right, well, they're for sure headed for a top six playoff spot. No, no, no doubt. And then I started to have doubts probably 2 weeks ago where I was like, oh, I don't know. They might be a play-in team. And then last week we came on here and I was like, well, I still feel pretty good about, them being in the playoffs. Now I'm sitting here today going, I don't know. It's just tight, and the Grizzlies still have so many difficult games remaining. The Clippers have a few beginning tonight, Clippers and Cavs. So like it's gonna be a fun potentially last few games because we don't know what's gonna happen with the standings, and there's probably going to be a lot of jockeying for position going on late in the season. So, but it again, it's been a whirlwind of a 48 hours, and it's just wild that we're here in this position after December, right? Like no one could have thought. No one could have thought with the Grizzlies in second place in December playing so well that the Grizzlies would be not under the direction of Taylor Jenkins and fighting to just get in the top 6 of the playoffs at this point in the season. So a lot has changed. We will see what happens over the next week. Anything you want to add, Chris? Go read our stuff over at the Daily Memphian. We got a lot up there.
Yeah, no, I've run out of words. I've written a lot, I've said a lot, and now I need to go recharged before I can have more words.
You're going back to bed? Is that what's going to happen here?
My nephew just walked in and looked at me while I was recording, so no, I think I'm gonna have to jump in the shower. We're gonna have to go spend the day with our nephew.
Well, you have fun doing that. Like I said, go check our stuff out. Chris has a column from last night. I've got a notebook with a bunch of stuff up. Jeff Calkins wrote a column last night off of the game. I also have a piece up about Asalo, and Chris has a column on the life cycle of NBA coaches from Friday as well. So go check out all that stuff. I think we got some really good insight in there. But until next time, for Drew and for Chris, we're out of here.